The small town of Ravenswood had always been quite peaceful despite its somewhat ominous name and the ancient forests. The towering pines that surrounded the community stood like silent sentinels watching over the scattered homes and humble businesses. In this quaint setting lived Thomas Hadley, a quiet man in his early 30s, who had recently moved into the old Victorian house at the edge of town near the abandoned railroad. Thomas had inherited the property from his great-uncle Edmund, affectionately known by locals as Special Eddy for his peculiar but gentle nature, a man Thomas had never met but had heard countless stories about from his mother throughout his. The house itself seemed to contain the lingering essence of its former occupant, with its creaking floorboards that moaned with each careful step and windows that sometimes appeared to fog without reason even on the warmest. As Thomas unpacked his modest belongings, he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something in the house was observing his every move with quiet curiosity. The first few nights in the old Victorian passed without incident, though Thomas often woke with the distinct impression that someone had whispered his name just moments before consciousness claimed. He dismissed these occurrences as simply the product of sleeping in an unfamiliar place and the natural sounds of an aging house settling into. During his first week in Ravenswood, Thomas ventured into town to gather supplies and perhaps meet some of the local residents who might have known his great-uncle and could share more about the mysterious relative he had. At the small corner market, Thomas was approached by an elderly woman who introduced herself as Martha Wilkins with eyes that seemed simultaneously kind and "So you're Special Eddy's boy," she had said without a hint of question in her voice while studying his face with uncomfortable intensity. "And he always said you'd come someday, when the house needed new blood to keep its secrets safe from those who wouldn't understand what lies." Thomas spent the remainder of that day meeting other townsfolk who all seemed to know exactly who he was before he could introduce himself. Each encounter followed a similar pattern: initial recognition followed by cryptic comments about his great-uncle and veiled references to some kind of inheritance beyond the. By the time Thomas returned home, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown garden path leading to the front door, which now stood slightly ajar. Thomas was certain he had locked the door before leaving, yet found himself unsurprised by its current state, as if some part of him had expected this very development. Upon stepping cautiously inside, Thomas called out, feeling somewhat foolish but compelled nonetheless, "Hello? Is anyone here?" and received no answer except the familiar settling. The following morning, Thomas awoke to find a small leather-bound journal on the nightstand beside his bed where nothing had been the night before. The journal was worn with age, its pages yellowed and filled with his great-uncle's distinctive handwriting that seemed to flow across the paper like dark water moving with purpose, and Thomas began reading, immediately drawn into the account of Edmund Hadley's life in the house and his unusual relationship with what he described as the other residents who existed between the walls and within the shadows. According to the journal entries, Edmund had discovered shortly after inheriting the house himself that it contained what he called thin places, spots where the boundary between this world and another had worn down to near transparency. These thin places allowed certain entities to partially cross over, particularly during the liminal hours of dawn and dusk, when the world itself balanced precariously between day and night. And Thomas might have dismissed the journal as the ravings of an eccentric old man had he not experienced the first visitation that very evening. He had been preparing a simple dinner in the kitchen when the lights flickered briefly and the temperature dropped so suddenly his breath clouded. A soft shuffling sound came from the dining room, followed by the gentle scraping of chair legs against the hardwood floor, as if someone Thomas stood frozen knife in hand as he watched the dining room doorway where a figure now stood, partially obscured by shadow yet undeniably. The figure was tall and thin, with proportions that seemed slightly wrong, as if its limbs were just a bit too long and jointed, in places where human arms end. "Hello, nephew," came a voice that sounded like dry leaves rustling across pavement yet somehow carried warmth and familiarity that stirred something deep within. "Special Eddy has been waiting for you to arrive at last, and now we can begin your education in the matters of this house." In the days that followed, Thomas discovered that his great-uncle had not exactly died in the conventional sense, but had rather transitioned into something else entirely, a guardian of the thin places and a mediator between the worlds that intersected within the house. Edmund explained that their bloodline had always been chosen for this task, passing the responsibility from one generation to the next when the time. "The house chose you just as it chose me all those years ago," Edmund told him during one of their twilight conversations while his form shifted between solidity and transparency. "You've felt it already, I know, the whispers in your mind and the subtle pull towards certain corners and shadows within these walls," and Thomas found himself surprisingly accepting of this extraordinary situation, perhaps because deep down he had always sensed he was different, somehow meant for something beyond the ordinary existence he had. The training began in earnest, with Edmund teaching Thomas how to recognize the thin places and the various entities that used them for passage. Some were benevolent, curious about the human world and content to observe, while others harbored darker intentions, seeking to fully cross over and take physical form through the displacement of. "This is why we are needed," Edmund explained one evening as they sat in the attic where the veil was particularly thin and shadowy. Figures drifted like smoke around them. Without a guardian to maintain the boundaries and establish rules for passage, the thin places would eventually tear open completely, allowing unrestricted travel. "You must learn to distinguish between those who mean no harm and those who would bring destruction if given the chance to fully materialize." Thomas learned that his great-uncle had earned the nickname Special Eddy not from any mental deficiency as he had initially assumed, but from his unique ability to communicate with beings from the other side and protect the town from their occasional malevolent. The townspeople had known for generations about the house and its importance, passing down stories about the Hadley family and their sacred duty to Martha Wilkins. Thomas discovered was actually something of an apprentice herself, having been taught certain protective measures by Edmund to use in emergencies when the guardian was indisposed or otherwise. "Your great-uncle saved this town more times than anyone can count," Martha told him during one of her instructional visits to the house, where, as months passed, Thomas grew more confident in his abilities, learning to sense disturbances in the thin places and communicate with the various entities. He developed a particular rapport with a gentle presence that identified itself as Lillian, a former resident of the house from the previous century. Lillian often provided historical context and additional insights that Edmund had not yet shared, making her an invaluable ally in Thomas's continuing education regarding. But not all encounters were pleasant, and Thomas soon faced his first true challenge when a particularly powerful entity began testing the boundaries more. Thomas first noticed something was wrong when shadows in the house began moving against the light source and the temperature fluctuations became more extreme. Edmund's form appeared less frequently, and when he did materialize, his expression was deeply troubled, his voice barely audible as he warned Thomas about. "It senses your inexperience and is probing for weaknesses in your guard," Edmund's flickering form explained urgently one night as the house groaned around them like a ship in a storm, though outside was perfectly still. This one has been attempting passage for decades, drawn by the energy of the living and particularly the power in our bloodline which it. Thomas felt a chill run through him as he realized that his presence in the house, his living, breathing body, was actually attracting this malevolent. Edmund had managed to keep it at bay 3 years of experience, but now with the transition of guardianship the entity sensed opportunity in. You must strengthen the boundaries tonight, Edmund instructed, fading rapidly as he spoke, or by morning it will have gathered enough strength to push. That night proved to be the most terrifying of Thomas's life as he worked frantically to reinforce the thin places following his great uncle's hurried. The entity, which Thomas had come to think of as the shadow, pushed relentlessly against the metaphysical barriers, causing physical manifestations throughout the house, doors slamming, windows shattering, and furniture moving. Thomas recited the protective incantations Edmund had taught him while using his own blood to seal the most vulnerable points where the boundaries had. Martha arrived near dawn, drawn by what she described as a terrible disturbance in the air itself, and together they managed to stabilize the. As sunrise approached, the pressure finally began to subside, leaving Thomas exhausted but triumphant in his first major test as guardian of the house. You did well, nephew, Edmund's voice came clear and strong the following evening, his form more solid than it had been in weeks as. The shadow will retreat to recover its strength, which gives us time to prepare better defenses and complete your training with greater urgency. And Thomas nodded, understanding now the true weight of the responsibility he had inherited and the critical importance of his role, not just to the. As weeks turned to months, Thomas grew into his position as guardian, discovering abilities that even Edmund had not fully explained, perhaps because some talents were unique to each guardian, emerging in response to specific challenges. Thomas found he could actually see the thin places now as faintly luminous outlines, like doorways sketched in light that shifted and moved depending. The townsfolk began to call him Special Tommy, with the same mix of respect and cautious distance they had shown his great uncle, though Thomas noticed they seemed more comfortable approaching him with concerns about strange occurrences or unsettling dreams that might indicate activity from the other side. Thomas took his responsibility to the community seriously, just as Edmund had, establishing regular patterns of checking the various thin spots around town. That the old railroad station proved particularly problematic, with its history of tragic accidents and lingering emotional residue that attracted entities seeking to feed on. 1 year after Thomas's arrival in Ravenswood, he had fully settled into his role, finding an unexpected peace in his unusual purpose and connection. On the anniversary of his arrival, Thomas sat in the garden behind the house watching the sunset with Edmund's spectral form beside him. And I never understood why you didn't tell the family about this, Thomas said quietly as darkness gradually claimed the landscape and the first stars. Edmund's form shifted slightly, something like a smile passing across his translucent features as he replied, some inheritances can only be understood when experienced. Would you have believed any of this if I had sent letters explaining about thin places and entities, and your destiny as their guardian? Thomas laughed softly, acknowledging the truth in his great-uncle's words, knowing that a year ago he would have dismissed such claims as delusional. Now he couldn't imagine any other existence finding purpose in his role as protector of the boundaries between worlds that intersected in the small. There's something I haven't told you, Edmund said, his voice growing serious as his form solidified in the growing darkness of the garden, where the entities have a name for our family, for the guardians who watch over the thin places and maintain the delicate balance between worlds. And Edmund's eyes seemed to glow slightly as he turned to face Thomas, directly they call us the sentence speakers because our words form the boundaries. Thomas finished understanding dawning on him as he recalled the incantations and phrases that seemed to shape reality when properly spoken with. Edmund nodded. 2 sentences spoken properly can create or destroy the veils between worlds depending on the speaker's intent and their connection to the. This explained why Thomas had always felt a strange power in his words even before coming to Ravenswood, a sense that language itself contained. Your final test approaches, Edmund said, his form beginning to fade as midnight drew near. When you face the shadow again, you'll need to. The warning came 3 nights later, when Thomas awoke suddenly at exactly 3 in the morning, every light in the house blazing without being. The air felt charged with electricity, and Thomas could hear a low, humming sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, and Edmund was nowhere to be found, though Thomas called for him repeatedly, searching each room for his great-uncle's familiar spectral form, but finding instead in every mirror and reflective surface Thomas saw the shadow watching him, a darkness deeper than absence of light that seemed to bend reality. Thomas understood this was the final test Edmund had warned him about, the confrontation that would either confirm him as the true guardian or. Thomas moved through the house methodically, reinforcing the boundaries at each thin place and preparing himself mentally for what he knew would be the. When he reached the attic, the thinnest place in the house where the barrier between worlds was barely more than metaphorical, Thomas found what he. The shadow had partially manifested, taking a form that resembled Edmund but twisted and wrong, with limbs that bent at impossible angles and features. You are not ready, little guardian, it spoke with a voice like breaking glass. The boundary weakens with each breath you take, and soon Thomas stood his ground, remembering everything Edmund had taught him about the power in his bloodline and the responsibility that came with being a. The entity lunged forward, attempting to reach through the thin place, and grasped Thomas with appendages that seemed to multiply and shift with each. Thomas spoke the first sentence with clear, deliberate precision, feeling the power build within each carefully chosen word that strengthened the boundary between worlds. The shadow shrieked in frustration as its form began to compress, pushed back toward its own reality by the force of Thomas's words, and with unwavering confidence Thomas spoke the second sentence, completing the incantation that would seal this particular thin place, permanently closing this specific doorway. As dawn broke, Thomas stood exhausted, but victorious, having faced the shadow and proven himself worthy of the title that had been his great-uncle's. The house felt different, somehow lighter, as if a long-held breath had finally been released, and the walls no longer creaked with quite the. Edmund appeared beside him as the first sunlight